Hello, good afternoon and welcome to our CPD webinar series. This webinar series is organised by Aina and Shirley from the National Building Control Office. Today we welcome Jacqui Donnelly, Fellow of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, Conservation Architect and an expert in bringing back homes and reuse of older buildings. Just a little bit about ourselves in the National Building Control Office. We work with the 31 local authorities in Ireland and industry and the department to promote compliance with the building regulations and the construction products regulations. We work through 5 pillars. We have compliance support pillar where we help you to comply with the building regulations and support you in compliance. We have an education and training pillar where we have our certificate in building control management delivered by IT Carlo in conjunction with ourselves. And we're working on masters in building regulatory compliance and building regulations. We have our inspections pillar where we actually go out with local authorities and we support them in inspections. And we've carried out a lot of inspections with local authorities this year. As a lot of people who have submitted commencement notices will know, our BCMS, that's our building control management system, and it's the preferred means of administration of building control in Ireland as set out in SI 9 of 201 for BCAR. And then we have our new market surveillance of construction products pillar, which we have started this year because of Brexit, because of a lot of construction products on the markets. And we want to ensure that all products used in construction are fit for the purpose which they are intended. With the framework for building control authorities, and then we will work with our guidelines for market surveillance authorities. And if you go to www.localgov.ie, you will go and see our newsletters and up-to-dates, our frequently asked questions. So I would recommend and welcome everybody to visit our website. And if you have any queries regarding market surveillance or building control, send it in to support@nbco.gov.ie and we will get back to you. This is our legislative framework under which we work, and we work under the building control regulations and building control acts. We work under the EU construction products regulations and the EU market surveillance regulations. So we've quite a big suite of regulation under which we work and try to enforce and get compliance with the health, safety and welfare of people in or about buildings, conservation of fuel and energy and access for all. We have a big army of building control inspectors on the ground in each local authority who are there to assist you in promoting compliance, promoting good building practice, promoting health, safety and welfare of people in or about buildings, and we are there to assist them. Now, if you use the question and answer function there on the bottom of your screen, you can ask questions throughout the webinar. And if we can't get to them at the end, we will answer them and put them up on our YouTube channel. All questions will be answered. Today, I would like everybody to think sustainability, focus on innovation and adaptive reuse of buildings. It is very important that we reuse our existing building stock. And what we need to remember is that every building we build today will be here in at least 75 years. And every building built in 1975, this is research, will be still in use in the year 2050. And it's also a sustainability issue. It's a climate initiative. And we need to promote our heritage, reuse our heritage. We have lots of products on the market. We're very innovative people. We have good designers, wonderful design certifiers, wonderful architects, wonderful engineers and surveyors. And really, innovation will keep these buildings alive in the center of our towns and cities, and keep the focus on a living city, a city where people can live, work and play. So I'm going to hand you over now to Jacqui Donnelly, and she will talk a little bit more on this. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mairead. Am I going to be able to share my screen?
You press the share, yes.
Okay, that's fine. Is that okay? Can everyone see that?
Can see you.
I'm probably going to turn off my video so I'm not in the...
Fine, yep.
So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. I see there's some conservation officers in the audience, so I hope I won't bore them. They've probably heard this many times before and know it better than I do. But just to talk you through what are the legislation, the policy and guidance, and as Mairead says, about the sustainability issues and about how we need to keep our buildings in use and bring them into the future with us. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Oh yeah. So I always like to start at the international level and say, you know, where is this all coming from? This isn't just something for Irish buildings. We have a lot of international commitments as members of as Ireland is a member of the UN, of UNESCO and the Council of Europe and the European Union. There are principles and best practice standards at an international level that we need to conform to and that we need to have regard to. Foremost among these is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is known as ICOMOS, produces a number of charters. Probably the most relevant to this case are the Venice Charter of 1964, and then more up to date, the Borough Charter, which was latest revision was in 2013. So these set out the principles and of best practice of what we're trying to actually do when we're conserving architectural heritage. Closer to home, in the Council of Europe, we have signed up to the Convention for the Protection of the Architectural Heritage of Europe, known as the Granada Convention. And that really set the basis for the legislation that came out in 1999 to protect architectural heritage, set up the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, was all part of the commitments we had made there. But we have national legislation as well, and it's not just the Planning and Development Acts. There are also the National Monuments Acts of 1930 to 2004. And just that you know, there are notification and consent requirements under these acts. And also of interest to yourselves that any buildings protected under the National Monuments Act are exempt from having to comply with building regulations. That's not to say that they don't have to be safe, comfortable places to live in, but it does take them outside the loop of having to actually meet the individual requirements of the building regs. So why are we doing all this? We are protecting our architectural heritage in the common good. They're a unique cultural resource and they are irreplaceable. People say they can build, you know, exactly the same building, but to the knowing eye, to the knowledgeable eye, these are just replicas that you cannot recapture the craftsmanship that you get from a unique historic building. And so we're not just talking about buildings of great artistic merit like the Custom House on the top there. We're also looking at everyday works of craftsmanship, how people used the environment, used the building materials and the landscape that they were in to construct buildings and other structures that are used to them. And now we also need to start thinking about sustainability and climate action. We need to think about reducing both building waste and the use of building products. We need to reuse the buildings we have already and recycle them as necessary too. And we also must think about things like cultural heritage, that cultural tourism, that we are actually, you know, these are what telling people, you know, what Ireland's contribution to global heritage was as well. This is what these buildings represent for us all. So this is why we're trying to protect these. I'm sure you're all familiar at this stage with the Architectural Heritage Protection Guidelines. They were a requirement under the Planning and Development Act 2000 for our minister to issue guidance to the planning authorities on how they were to protect their architectural heritage, both as regarding what kind of buildings they should be trying to protect, but also how they would deal with planning applications or development applications for changing them, and how to, because conservation is about managing change. It's not about stopping change. It's about making sure that what is special about the buildings is kept through the process of change. So these are statutory guidelines. They were issued under Section 28 and Section 57 of the Act. And so the local authorities must have regard to them when they're carrying out their functions. Unfortunately, they're no longer available in hard copy. I think we had hoped by this stage they'd have been in the second edition, but you can still download them from our buildingsofireland.ie website. And I always think it's worth looking at what is the definition of a protected structure, because it is actually quite an all-encompassing definition. The protection can extend to the interior of the structure, the land and its curtilage, so the package of land associated with the building, any structures within that curtilage and their interiors, and then all features and fixtures which form part of the interior, exterior of any of those structures. And then even larger scale, it can be applied to any specified feature within the attendant grounds. So this would be set out in the development plan, in the record of protected structures. So for example, with a country house, they might say, and it includes all gate lodges, domain features and the like. So the definition can be quite extensive. And protected structures have to be of special interest according to the Planning and Development Act. So there are a number of categories set out, and I'll just talk you through them to give you an idea of what it is that makes a building special enough to be on the RPS. It can be of architectural interest, which means it could be either a very good exemplar of a particular style or time of style or of, fashion of buildings at the time. It could be the work of a major architect or designer. So I'm just showing here Bossaurus because there's no limit on what date a protected structure has to be before it's protected. So modern movement buildings can and are protected structures. A building could be of historical interest. So again, it could epitomize a particular era or time. I'm showing here a protected structure on Moore Street in Dublin, which was associated with the Easter Rising. So while it is an important 1760s building in its own right, so it's of architectural interest for that reason, but it's particularly of historical interest because of its association with the Easter Rising and the fact that this was supposed to be where the last meeting was held of the rebels before they surrendered. So that has actually put it into a different category. It's actually now a national monument in state ownership as well because of those particular interests as well. A structure could be of archaeological interest, so telling what we can learn from the past, from a particular building or structure. So many of these structures would also be recorded monuments. And this is Turbally in County Galway. So it's of architectural interest, quite obviously. It's of archaeological interest. It's also of cultural interest because it was somewhere where W.B. Yeats lived with his family. So it has all those. It was also converted at a later stage by William Scott, who was a very prominent architect of the early 20th century. So you can see a structure kind of all kinds of overlaying and intermingled special interests. Artistic interest then is generally to do with, as I say, more difficult to define, but in this case, we're using an example of this church interior. And as you can see, it's not just of architectural interest, but then there's also the extra interest of the mosaic work, the sculpture, the wall decorations, the stained glass, which all gives it that extra special interest. Something might be of cultural interest because it's associated with a literary context or with maybe cinematic. I'm showing here an early 20th century library. So again, very interesting from a cultural interest, the cultural development of the country with all these Carnegie libraries that were rolled out in the early part of the 20th century. So that is a cultural interest as well. Scientific interest, I'm using here the example of a thatched building where you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you can see there's the new layers of reed thatch here. There's the scraw to which it's attached, but in between is a layer of the old thatch. And we would always say, don't remove thatch fully from a roof, that where the older layers are sound, they should be kept in place, because there's a wealth of scientific interest that can be gleaned from these, as well as dating. We get information about the types of crops that were grown. We now can look for climate information, what kind of climate was prevailing, how these crops were harvested. So a lot of interest there as well, of scientific interest that you mightn't immediately think of. Technical interest could be something to do with the use of a new type of technology, a new building material. But also we need to look at things like our masonry arch bridges, which in their day were of great technical interest. They have shown the test of time. Many of these now are a couple of 100 years old and they're still part of the national infrastructure. So they have great technical interest, a challenge as well to keep them in good order, keep them working. Social interest, again, is a bit more difficult to define. It's something that is of youth interest to a community, brings them together, reminds them of how society worked and how their people lived before them in society. And so of interest here is a telephone box. This is actually quite an interesting example, a very rare example of a K1 telephone kiosk. And of course, these are falling out of use now, so we have to rethink their use, but they are very important pieces of street furniture and great social interest. So they're the categories of special interest. A building could also be protected by being within an architectural conservation area under Section 81 of the Act. And this is a way of protecting groups or structures that are distinctive or important. Maybe looking at protecting a group of where the exteriors are of interest, but maybe the interiors don't merit protection. An ACA can also be used to protect the setting of a protected structure. It can be used to protect a designed landscape and the structures within them. So you might have an industrial heritage landscape, like a mill building, that would have a lot of other structures associated with it, like mill ponds and weirs and mill races and bridges and other structures. And an ACA would be a good way of protecting them and the way they interconnect with each other. But really, an ACA can be any group of related structures. A building can also be protected as a protected structure within an ACA. If not, if it's just protected because it's in an ACA, then the works to the interior are exempt from planning permission. But there might be restrictions to the type of work an owner could carry out to the exterior of the building. So what does it all mean in practice? There are different requirements for planning applications. So the test is that all works which would materially affect the character of a protected structure need planning permission. And this includes works to the interior of the building, to the exterior of the building, and even where the works are to comply with building regulations or fire safety certificate work. If it materially affects the character of the protected structure, it needs planning permission. And this is why it's very important that these any changes to comply with building regs or fire safety, they need to be included and thought about at a very early stage, so that if they have a material effect on the character of the building, it can all be included in the planning permission, the planning application. There is no separate process for protected structures as there are in some other jurisdictions. All planning applications are lodged in the same way for all structures. And a protected structure can only be demolished in exceptional circumstances. And an owner cannot look for outline planning permission for a protected structure. Again, because of this, that it's in the detail as to whether the works materially affect the character of the building. So outline planning permission, may not be valid if the details would affect the character of the building. So an owner can look to the local authority for a Section 57 declaration. And they don't necessarily have to have specific works in mind when they're looking for a declaration. It can just be to open a conversation with the local authority, like what is important about the building from the local authority's reason, why have they added it to the RPS, so what works can the owner carry out or not. Often it's recommended that if an owner is thinking of doing specific works, it might be more advisable for them to look for a Section 5 declaration to clarify what the need for planning permission is. Local authority has a statutory requirement to visit the building and issue the declaration within 12 weeks of the request. But this Section 57 declaration can't exempt any works for planning permission that would not otherwise require them. So it can really only clarify and row back on what it means with the protected structure status of the building. So I'm just going to talk you through the conservation principles, so that get an understanding of what is special about the building and why we're trying to protect it. And again, these are all the conservation principles laid out in our guidelines are all underpinned by the international charters and conventions that are internationally accepted of good practice of protecting architectural heritage. So these aren't in any particular order. There's no one more important than the others. Some of them overlap. We would say that keeping a building in use is important, that it gives a building an economic value. It gives the owners a reason for keeping it in use, keeping it in good condition. Usually the original use for which it was built is the most appropriate. So a house is often most appropriately to continue in residential use. But we all know, looking at the Georgian houses around Dublin, they are capable of adaptation to many different types of use. So what's important is that the new use is appropriate to the building, that it doesn't require extensive intervention or loss of character or loss and disturbance of significant fabric of the building. But most buildings are capable of change. What is important, again, is to make sure that what is special about the building doesn't become compromised during this process of change. We would always say that an owner, their architects and advisors need to understand the building before they start the works or before they even propose changes. They need to research the building's history, how it's changed over time, what kind of implications that has for different parts of the buildings, that they should look not at problems in isolation, like this damp problem here, where obviously somebody has decided to put in vents. There's obviously damp problems building up around, and the ground is softening. And really what's quite obvious here is that a rain barrel was taken away. So it's important not to go punching holes in walls, putting in vents without understanding what is causing the problem. And that's just a very simple example of not understanding the building. Obviously, it can be more complex. And to understand how traditionally built buildings work, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, these buildings were built with softer, more flexible materials, and that needs to be respected when changes are being made. And also you need to understand and analyse the results of all this research to find out what is the reason for the decay before you start proposing changes. And we would also advise owners to get the right advice, that it can be expensive and very damaging, and sometimes impossible to undo poorly carried out alterations and repairs. That people should look for independent professionals, not somebody just trying to sell them an individual product or a service, and to make sure their advisors and their contractors have the right skills for the job, that they know how to deal sympathetically with an older building, that they're not just used to dealing with modern construction, that they understand the principles of repair and of conservation. And protecting special interest, I'm still using this example. I really can't find a better example to use, but this is just a small building in a country town on the main street, and somebody did alterations to this building, and just shows they just didn't understand what was special about the building. You can see on the left that it had this very serene facade, kind of neo-Tudor 19th century look to its style. If you look very closely, you can actually see that the render was ruled and lined to make it look as if it was masonry, ashlar masonry. It had these very unusual sash windows with horizontal glazing bars, so up and down sliding sash windows, which meant they were able to run a gutter across the dormer with no problem. And you can see here what has happened to the building with, I think, no bad intentions, just not understanding what was special about it. They took off all the render thinking that to expose this stonework would be a good thing, whereas in actual fact, originally it was never, this kind of masonry was never intended to be exposed, not only for aesthetic reasons, but the render was very important for the weatherproofing of the building, keeping the rain out, protecting the interior of the building. Windows were put in, but they're casements. You can see there are hinges on either side. And while they tried to keep the glazing pattern with the horizontal bars, because the windows open out, they're not able to put the gutter back. So while they kept the slates, the fact that they can't put a gutter back on the building means the water all pours down the window or down the wall. Again, no render there, so further jeopardizing the health of the building and the welfare of the people inside as well by creating a damp and moldy building. And as I say, really undermining and compromising what was special about the building in the first place. Another principle of conservation is minimal intervention. And I think the Borough Charter that I mentioned before puts it best. It says you should do as much as is necessary and as little as possible, because our older buildings can be damaged as much by over-restoration as by neglect. And often the best conservation work is low-key, involves the least amount of work, and can be inexpensive. So bulging walls, unevenness, bowing, they're not necessarily imperfections that need to be ironed out. And you can see with this building, the lintel is slightly askew, but if it's not letting in water and if it's not structurally unstable, there's no reason why an old building has to look brand new when the works are finished. And also to appreciate all the parts of the structure and not just concentrate on what's original. Look at the alterations that they may contribute to the building's unique character. And you can see here at least 3, if not 4, if you count the roof lights, different evolutions of this building over time with each new owner. This is around the back of the building, where often people didn't go changing all the windows at one time. They would leave the back or the basements unchanged. But it tells us so much about the building and the way it evolved. But similarly, new alterations and additions must also be well constructed and designed so they don't detract from the building. Repairing rather than replacing. So conservation is about preserving the authentic fabric of the building, keeping the not only the materials, but the kind of wealth of information about tooling and chiseling marks, mouth blown and hand cut glass and the like. And a good repair should delay the process of decay and prolong the life of the building or the element of the building without damaging its special interest. And traditional buildings are usually capable of being repaired quite easily, as you can see here with the baluster where a new piece was spliced in. Often modern building materials are less capable, like concrete and the like, less capable of gentle repair. Repairs can be honest, as so can alterations. You know, they don't have to be artificially disguised or aged. Sometimes a good repair can leave an interesting record of the works done, but that doesn't mean they should detract from the visual integrity of the structure. You should use the right materials and methods, traditional materials that have, and repair methods that have stood the test of time and have shown that they work. And really, modern materials and techniques should only be used where we have firm evidence that they won't cause damage. Ensuring that changes can be reversed is also an important conservation principle. It isn't a justification for inappropriate interventions, but it does allow for future correction of unforeseen problems should they arise. So here you can see a laser partition was taken out. They hadn't damaged the lovely Rococo centerpiece. They hadn't done any damage to the very elaborate cornice. So that was able to be reversed, taken out. It's not always possible, but it should be a principle to work on. And we would always advise planning authorities as well to avoid incremental change. It can be hard for them to refuse planning permission for small alterations, but you can see with the change of roof slates here or to asbestos cement tiles, painting individual chimney stacks. Actually, the windows are still all the originals here, but you can just see how the architectural integrity of a group of buildings like this can fall apart with small incremental changes. We also advise the avoidance of the use of architectural salvage because it can confuse the understanding of the building. It can also create a market for theft and dismantling of other historic buildings. And while using new traditional materials like stone or slate or timber, it does encourage traditional skills and craftsmanship. But obviously, there are occasions when it will be appropriate to use salvage materials, but providing their provenance has been established. So just to point you to some other guidance documents that we have published in the department. These were originally designed specifically for the owners of historic buildings, but they also set out what the department feels can be considered good practice and direct advisors, contractors, as to what they should be doing when they're dealing with older buildings and what is considered good practice. It's a series of 12 buildings. The latest was published just at the end of last year on disaster risk management. Just talk briefly about access and a bit more detail about the energy efficiency because they're probably the most appropriate to yourselves. Access we published, it was written primarily by Gráinne Shaffrey of Shaffrey Associates Architects and Fionnuala Rogerson Architects. So this was a joint publication we did with the National Disability Authority, and it was giving advice on improving the accessibility of historic buildings and places. So I'd advise you have a look at it if you're involved in that. I'll talk a little bit more about energy efficiency because this is a topic that is, going to be very much to the fore in the next number of years. We published this guidance back in 2010. The principal authors were Paul Arnold Architect and the Energy Research Group in UCD. And again, it set out the principles of upgrading energy efficiency for older buildings. And what we call them traditionally built buildings because it was more about the way they were built with solid masonry walls rather than necessarily just their architectural heritage interest. We're currently engaged in updating and making those guidance a lot more detailed, aimed at the professional user. And this is action we were given under Action 50D of the Climate Action Plan 2019. We have a project steering group that's running at the moment, consisting of ourselves. We're now the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, so Built Heritage Policy and Building Standards. The Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, Department of Education and Skills, Heritage Council, Office of Public Works, and FRIAI. Because under the Climate Action Plan, there are going to be 500,000 homes to be refitted to B2 or equivalent building energy rating, or cost optimal equivalent. Also, there's a requirement for public sector buildings to be upgraded as well. And the EU renovation wave aims to at least double the annual energy renovation rates within the next 10 years. So this is a serious challenge, and we would rather these buildings were considered and properly assessed and with the upgrading, rather than exempted and just said, oh, it doesn't apply to protected structures or doesn't apply to traditionally built buildings. We would rather these buildings are properly done, properly upgraded, to make sure we're not going to damage them. So as I said, it's going to update and build on the guidance of the 2010 publication. It's intended to provide clear and robust advice to the professional user while being accessible to a wider audience. We're looking at both residential, non-residential, traditional buildings, and it will include modelled case studies in NEEP and DEEP. We have a contract team working on it at the moment, led by the IGBC with Carrick Conservation International, KRA and Passivate. We're hoping to go for public consultation this summer with publication later in the year. So just what is a traditional building? So for the purposes of this guidance, we've defined them as buildings built with solid masonry walls, so no cavities, often brick or stone, sometimes with a render finish. They usually were originally built with single glazed timber or metal framed windows, timber framed roofs with slate or tile covering. As I say, they were generally of flexible, soft construction using lime mortars, usually with shallow foundations. So they were built to flex and move with and respond to environmental conditions. They were generally built with no damp-proof courses. And it was the type of construction that was used for almost all buildings constructed in Ireland before 1940. So it's a large percentage of the building stock. So we included in our 2010 guidance just how modern construction behaves. So it's all about stopping water getting into the fabric of the building, and then having to provide ventilation to make sure that the interior air quality stays good for the occupants. It's all about having damp-proof courses, impermeable surfaces and the like. Whereas traditional buildings they relied on the thickness of the exterior walls, these solid masonry walls. They relied on the thickness to make sure that rainwater and damp didn't penetrate to the interior of the building before external environmental conditions would change and the wind and sun would dry out the walls. So natural ventilation was provided naturally, either through chimney stacks or through the meeting rails of sash windows, or through ventilation in between the roof slates or ventilation at eaves. So they're very differently constructed and very different ways of dealing with environmental conditions. So these were building methods that evolved over centuries, making use of the best available materials and craft skills, and with an understanding of local weather conditions. So traditional buildings are vapor permeable, so they need to breathe, so allow atmospheric, as I say, water, to, both vapor and liquid water. They need to be able to breathe in order to function properly, so absorb and release moisture to the atmosphere depending on what the weather is like outside, and they did rely on ventilation to the interior. So regardless of what kind of statutory protection applies to these buildings, the works to upgrade them need to take account of the different type of construction. And it's very important to understand how these buildings work before people carry out works or propose works to them to upgrade their energy efficiency, because sealing them up will not work and will cause problems to the interior of the building, to the fabric of the building, and also to the people, the inhabitants. So there needs to be a balance between energy conservation requirements and building conservation requirements. So good ventilation is critical to the well-being of these buildings. We don't want to start trapping moisture within the building materials, like interstitial condensation within the wall or condensation on the actual surfaces as well. Also very concerned that moisture levels don't build up in timber elements, because at a certain moisture content level, timber becomes very vulnerable to insect attack, to mold and attack, dry rot and the like. And our people too need to live in properly ventilated living spaces for health and comfort. And I think we've all become much more aware of this since the pandemic. We realize how significant it is that good air quality on the insides of our buildings is very important. So our recommendations are that there needs to be, prior to any upgrading, there needs to be an assessment of the building, looking at the whole building before honing in on the individual elements to see how they can be upgraded. Generally, the best way is to start with simple things like draft proofing windows and doors, insulating the roof, replacing outdated services, because most of these buildings were not built with these electrical, gas, water services in the first place. So they have been retrofitted so they can be changed again. Then you get into more difficult things like repairing shutters, installing secondary glazing, floor insulation, and then wall insulation can be particularly problematic with these buildings. So it needs to be properly considered and a stepped approach taken, making sure that you don't get locked into certain decisions by decisions that are made early on in the process of upgrading if there's going to be a stepped approach taken. There may be problems with energy upgrading works and need for planning permission, because again, as I said, if it materially affects the character of the building, or if it affects the character of an architectural conservation area, planning permission will be required. And this may be problematic, particularly with external wall insulation, internal wall insulation in a protected structure where it would interfere with important decorative schemes or require removing cornices, paneling and the like. And then removing historic windows and glazing. So we would always recommend exploring other options like installing secondary glazing first. And then just to finish off, looking at adaptation and reuse. You will all know better than me that the purpose of the building regulations is to provide for the health, safety and welfare of people in and around buildings. They don't necessarily apply to these kind of buildings except where there's a material change of use. But we would always draw people's attention to that paragraph in the technical guidance documents, which acknowledges that the guidance in the TGDs may not be appropriate for existing buildings, particularly where they're of architectural and historical interest. And the TGDs themselves do recommend alternative approaches may be more relevant and should be considered. And as you know, probably the most important ones are the ones where problems are most likely to arise, or with fire safety and access and use. And while protected structures and proposed protected structures are exempt from Part L, that doesn't mean to say that people don't want to upgrade these buildings as well and make them more energy efficient. And then Part E, as you know, was a number of years ago, was amended to apply to existing buildings. So that has implications for historic buildings too. This was a building that, a publication from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government that came out in 2018, and it was a manual for reusing and adapting existing buildings for housing. And the idea was to outline the steps to take and the regulations. It wasn't specific to historic buildings. Now, I was on the working group that put this together. We not necessarily all our advice was taken on board. Because it was been produced by the Department of Housing then. But they did include a number of case studies of historic buildings, many of which were proposed by myself and my colleague, Nikki Matthews, put forward these case studies, which were accepted. And I'm just going to show you some of these. Nikki would have been aware of these from her work in Dublin City Council. So we knew these were buildings that had been repaired to the best and upgraded to the best conservation standards, as well as bringing important buildings back into use. So this first example, I think it's Thomas Street, a 3-story over basement building in the city centre. As well as being a protected structure, it was discovered that the building actually had significant elements that dated to the 17th century, which made it a recorded monument as well. The works were carried out to a high standard of conservation. The timber framing was able to be, and the staircase were able to be retained as part of the change to the building. So it met all the necessary standards, and it produced a building at the end of high quality, a lovely residential unit with a commercial unit at the ground floor and an independent, as I say, accessed unit up above. So it really shows how a building with such complications to it, with the right architect and an understanding, a caring owner, was able to be brought back into use. Here's another one from a different planning authority area, but a two-story building that had a shop and at the ground floor and offices above, and it was refurbished as a living space. So they were able to retain the shop facade and incorporate into the development, but convert the whole house back into a residential use. And a final example, you probably guessed from looking at the photographs, this is on Dawson Street, overlooking with glimpses at one part of it, overlooking St. Stephen's Green. So these properties were brought back into use with apartments on the first and second floors, or on the upper floors. I think there might be 2 floors up above. And again, it was all carried out in compliance with building regulations and provided really high quality living accommodation while keeping the commercial units at the ground floor level. And so really high quality, beautiful, with roof garden overlooking Stephen's Green. I mean, these buildings can provide very high standard living accommodation if they're properly treated. So just to conclude, to quote from Carl Elefante, an American architect who was a former president of the American Institute of Architects, who coined the phrase that the greenest building is the one that's already built. So I think I started telling you about setting the international context to these as regards conservation, but now we need to look at the international context as regards our planet, about looking at sustainability and climate action and what historic buildings can contribute to that debate. Our existing buildings contain a lot of embodied energy which will be lost if a building is demolished. And there have been numerous studies that show that the greenhouse gas emissions involved in replacing a building, in demolishing a building, replacing it one of a similar size, it can take decades to recover that. And we don't have decades anymore as regards climate action. So we need to make use of our not only full buildings, but we need to start looking at the underused and unused floor space in our towns and cities. I mean, we keep hearing the argument about densification. We have the floor space there. We just need to bring it back into use. We need to, and I've shown you with those 3 case studies how those upper floors can be brought back into use. It will require a multidisciplinary approach often within the design team, but also within the local authority. It needs building control, architectural conservation, planning and the like, all to get together at an early stage to help with the design decisions that are needed to make sure that everything is properly considered and to enable these buildings to be brought back into use, because we strongly believe that with good and innovative design and some flexibility on both sides, these buildings can contribute to our modern lives. They can provide safe and comfortable, and I would say above all, beautiful places in which we can live and work. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing now, Mairead, if you want to.
Thank you very much, Jacqui, for a very concise and excellent presentation and a lot of food for thought there. And I think the takeaway from everybody for this is the greenest building is the one that's already built. And that's very important to think about. We do have to think of the future generations, and what's this to say? We didn't inherit the earth from our parents, we borrowed it from our children. And we do have a wealth of built heritage, which contributes to the economic and social life of this country. And building control officers, conservation officers, fire officers, planning officers, all contribute to this. So we really should be talking to one another and ensuring that we actually maintain quite a lot of this fabric. It is a good climate change initiative, and we have lovely innovative building practices that we can actually use and we should be using. And Jacqui outlined very good information there, and I would suggest that everybody go look for it on your website. The 12 little booklets, they're wonderful little booklets. The energy efficiency for older buildings, that's another wonderful publication. And we all will have to work together in doing that retrofitting for those 500,000 buildings. So we need to start talking to one another, and our climate action is very important. So I don't know, Shirley, have we any questions? Or if we have, we will answer them.
No, we don't. We just have, we've one in the Q&A. Let me just check. Yeah, there's one question there in the Q&A from Michael Lyons.
Michael Lyons, yes, expert fire safety. Yeah, a number of fire safety guides published by the department over the years, example flats, houses, but not specifically for heritage buildings, which would provide specific trade-off guidance to avoid the guidance which is written for brand new construction or relaxation for designers. Right, that's a very good question, Michael, and I don't think we'll answer that here today.
No, I mean, I think it's important to point out we're only 6 months in this department, Department of Housing. We were culture heritage in the Gaeltacht up until middle of last year. I had always hoped to get the chance to do an advice series on fire. I got as far as actually tendering and had a panel, but unfortunately when the crisis hit and our staff and our resources all reduced, we weren't able to go ahead with it. But I still hope that someday in the future we will be able to work with our new colleagues now in the fire safety section to advance that.
And we'll be looking at that ourselves, Michael, as part of our role in remit in the National Building Control Office, where we try and support the fire officers and those that are doing the fire safety certificate and building control officers. So if there's nothing else, Shirley, I think
some more questions there.
We'll thank
just some private messages just saying it was a great presentation, and they were thanking, you know, both of you for your time. Feedback.
But that everybody is very welcome, and we're delighted to have everybody. And thank you very much. And we'll circulate you our link to our YouTube channel. And there are some other presentations that we have there. And what we're trying to do is work with everybody and work together to actually promote safe, sustainable, healthy buildings, and buildings that will sustain the time. And we don't want to be retrofitting them 5 years after they're built. We need good buildings. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Mairead, for the opportunity. That was great.
Sheila Broderick there. Yeah, fire safety, sorry, it needs to be addressed. Yes, Sheila. Thank you for that comment. Shirley, I think we'll close the meeting now. And Jacqui, thank you very much. And thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Baina.
No problem.